Welcome to the daily news channel in the United States. Russia's objectives in Ukraine continue to dwindle by the day. All Putin wants right now is a minor triumph. Even with these shortened plans, the weary Russian army cannot make an advance, and time is running out in favor of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces launched a counteroffensive and began to drive the Russian army out of the territory it had lost. The Russian army, having failed to dislodge the Ukrainian government in Kiev, limited its aims and redeployed its forces, and the Russian army targeted a specific area of the Danbas. In truth, the Russian army outnumbered the Ukrainian army in terms of armaments, if not in terms of soldiers. It was believed that it, together with Russian tanks, aircraft, helicopters, and heavy artillery, would build a significant dominance over the Ukrainian armed forces. But it appears that battles are eventually won by infantry, and it is not enough to rely solely on the army to win the war. A very good approach must be established. This was Russia's greatest vulnerability. The Russian army suffered huge losses due to a lack of planning. The date on which Russia began the occupation was a mistake in and of itself. Weather conditions at the time made it hard for Russian armored vehicles to advance or slow down in the region. Although the same circumstances existed in Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces had been training for such an attack for 8 years, giving them an advantage over Russia. The Russian army's maturation was also a fantastic opportunity for the Ukrainian army under Putin. Instead of examining all of these difficulties, firing senior commanders, and disciplining them after each setback, Russia has switched to smaller regions, believing it has built more solid plans. But the conflict in Ukraine continues to go extremely badly for Russia in today's confrontations. The paratroopers of the famed 80th Air Assault Brigade of Lviv thoroughly decimated a detachment of the 104th Guards Air Assault Regiment from Russia's Pskov area. The Ukrainian armed forces said that the Russian army had been beaten as a result of the combined efforts of the artillery units of the Ukrainian Airstrike Forces 80th Air Assault Brigade. The 80th Air Assault Brigade was credited with effectively destroying 20 Russian military troops and 8 armored vehicles. 3 Russian tanks were among the wrecked vehicles. 3 amphibious infantry combat vehicles and 2 BMP, 2 amphibious infantry fighting vehicles. According to reports, a unit from Russia's 104th Guards Assault Regiment has had confrontations and losses with Levy paratroopers in the region since 2014, when the Ukrainian incursion began. These two forces battled in hand-to-hand combat, and the Ukrainian 80th Air Assault Brigade was able to emerge victorious. The fight is continuing on a path that will mirror the conflict between these two unions when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Many observers argue that the conflict started in 2014, regardless of February 24, 2022, because the annexation of Crimea plainly indicated what Russian President Putin was going for. With escalating separatist rebellions in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas immediately following the acquisition of Crimea, Ukrainian military forces were weakened, and Russia continued to support these regions. Everyone underestimated the Danbas region's 2 breakaway areas. However, several observers predicted that these 2 areas would constitute a significant threat to Ukraine, and this proved to be true. Following that, Ukraine took a step back. Putin, citing Ukraine's ambition to join NATO, said that he also recognized the independent republics of Luhansk and Danbas. This justification was no longer valid, and Ukraine took a step back as a result. All he had to do was press the start button, and it would begin. He now had a legitimate reason and a massive army that he claimed would take over Ukraine in 3 days. Even from recent history, Putin wasn't learning. Invading a nation that is notably dedicated to freedom and democracy was not easy, and even 60 years ago, during the Soviet era, 14 million of its residents were killed due to starvation for the sake of Russia's basic goals. Yes, there is a recent example that Putin was unable to perceive and learn from. Yes, we are discussing Afghanistan in recent history. Indeed, if we go back a little further, the example of Vietnam becomes much more important when we examine the U.S. Army, which is now widely regarded as the most powerful in the world, with Russia obviously in second place. These two superpowers frequently avoided one-on-one confrontations with cold relations and learned from each other's mistakes, sometimes taking each other's special equipment and troops as an example in developing their armies, but Russia, under Putin, does not appear to have learned any lessons from history. History constantly repeats itself, and when the United States Army undertakes an operation in Vietnam, the slap of history is quite harsh. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union backed the opposing side. Ukraine's current condition is the polar opposite. Russia wishes to attack Ukraine, and the U.S., as the guarantee of Ukraine's territorial integrity, legitimately supports the Ukrainian army. As a result, the United States departed Vietnam deeply disappointed, and the main reason for this was the Soviet Union's military equipment backing the opposing side. Furthermore, the United States battled Afghanistan for 20 years, and Russia fought for 10 years before that. As a result, neither Russia nor the United States were able to declare victory in Afghanistan. Finally, the U.S. government determined that continuing the war here was useless and withdrew. Indeed, U.S. President Joe Biden's declaration that he took this action to end the world's continuous conflicts said it all months after Russia observed it personally. Ukraine was assaulted. Ukraine was a community with a far larger army than Afghanistan's and a high level of solidarity. In the Middle East, there is also the example of Iraq and Syria. Russia was attacking Ukraine's armed forces while the U.S. was fighting a jihadist organization in Afghanistan. I see Russian President Putin's knowledge and perception of all of this, as well as his war on Ukraine, as pure craziness and stupidity. The invasion of Iraq occurred in front of Russian President Putin's eyes, and he should have learned a lesson from the fact that the 21st century is no longer a century fit for entirely conquering a nation. Guerrilla attacks caused significant harm to armies in all battles fought beyond their own land. Even though Russia was losing, the casualties were high. It might still be a target. This purpose might be defined as causing political instability in Ukraine. The political instability in the nation has been exacerbated by the disarray and toppling of the administration as a result of the region's wars. Perhaps this is why Russia's initial objective was so important in ousting Kiev. Russia would depose Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and plunge the country into insurmountable political turmoil. At present, it is apparent that airstrikes and severe shelling are insufficient to conquer a city and occupy a country, and that the ground operation must absolutely succeed. In truth, this was the point at which Russia became trapped. The Russian army, which began bombing on February 24th, attacked important locations in Ukraine. This was portrayed in the international media as a simple triumph for Russia, but when the subject was left to the ground operation, the Russian army became extremely disorganized. This uncertainty is the consequence of strategic errors as well as excessive confidence, because if you don't take measures, the forces in front of you will use whatever advantage you give them to annihilate you right now. Ukraine should be more firm in its new efforts. Taking lessons from these challenges, recapturing Kherson from Russia makes perfect sense. If the Ukrainian armed forces counterattack culminates in the seizure of the strategically vital city, the lock can be unlocked. However, against the established Russian army, caution is required, and actions should be undertaken on a more strategic basis. We hope that Ukraine will completely defend its freedom and territorial integrity, and that Russia will withdraw its soldiers. We aspire to a long-term peace accord between Russia and Ukraine that protects Ukraine's territorial integrity and freedom. Although Putin violated the Budapest deal by annexing Crimea in 2014, a similar agreement was reached in 1994 in exchange for the disarmament of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. It was signed by the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom in order to remain healthy, happy, and peaceful.